All right, hello everyone. My name is Aaron Standard, and this is part 2 of our video series on how artificial intelligence is impacting open source and open source businesses. Now, this is the first blog post, which we covered in the first video, so I'll go ahead and link to all that here. But the basic gist of this is that large language models are not killing open source, far from it. In fact, if anything, they're creating a flywheel for driving massive growth and installs. And we've seen that, Tailwind has seen that, and Service Bus has seen that. It's been great. The problem is that Tailwind's business has been very negatively impacted by large language models. They've down 80% on the revenue, whereas for support subscriptions, which is one part of our business, we're up 20% in the same year. So how did that happen? Well, this bears down to a real simple issue, which is how well aligned is your business model in an era where artificial intelligence can commodify expertise. Let's dive in. So just to kind of recap what we covered in the previous video, this is from Adam's post, which I linked to in the blog post here, and I'll link to it again in the description as well, where he basically said, look, our downloads are off the charts. In fact, they're up by 126%. But revenue's down 80%. We had to lay off 75% of our engineering team as a result of our revenue getting squashed. And the real issue around why that is twofold. It's that traffic to their documentation is down 40% since 2023. That's their primary entry point into their sales funnel. And then on top of that, most of what they sell via Tailwind Plus are components and themes. And these are things that large language models can just go ahead and synthesize right out of the gate. So effectively, what Tailwind was selling through their business was effectively a lower friction way of getting started with their open source library, which is rather than having to go and design your own dashboard theme or dashboard components from scratch, you could just buy ours as part of a, I think I have the pricing down here somewhere, a $300 personal subscription or a $1,000 subscription for a team, essentially. Well, here's where the math on that breaks down, where it creates a problem. If I have a $20 or $30 cursor subscription and I want to go and design a Tailwind based, or actually I don't even care if it's Tailwind. I'm just going to let Cursor recommend whatever if I'm doing vibe coding. I go ahead and I tell, Cursor, I would like you to go ahead and help me build a dashboard for measuring customer retention and sales for this Stripe powered, subscription I'm selling. Well, I could go ahead and spend tens of hours learning how Tailwind works and designing that, prototyping it, mocking it up myself. I could go ahead and basically, take a look through their documentation and see some custom components that look nice, and maybe I'll pay a subscription so I can download and tinker with those. And in total, I'm looking at, potentially 40 to 60 hours worth of work potentially if it's all said and done. Whereas if I'm feeling like, I want to get some instant gratification here, I can just tell Cursor, you know what? Why don't you go ahead and prototype 4 variations of this dashboard for me? And, I'll come back from a extended coffee break here and review the results once we're done. And I personally have done that workflow before with doing UI mockups. I'm not going to be super duper interested necessarily in the unique facets of the library being used, what the individual choices are. I want to just take a look at the end product and decide, does this match what I want? And if one of them is good enough, I'll take that, start iterating on it, and work with the AI to help ultimately deliver a market solution. That is a very different, like a sort of evaluation and cost sort of equation than what Tailwind had. Tailwind basically was built around helping eliminate human friction to getting from A to B with their products. But with large language models, that friction is even lower because there's no learning curve. I can get several different variants all built right away. I don't have to wait or do anything myself. I can have my computer work on this while I'm off doing something else. So that's a big problem for a business like Tailwind's, where they're in the business of basically monetizing their own learning curve. Here's something I can sell you that will get you instant results, and it'll only cost your team $1,000 a year. Well, if I can get the same value from a $30 a month Cursor subscription, and I can get the results right now instead of still having to spend lots of time working with your custom component, I'm going to do that. And that's where a business like the Tailwind Labs team is kind of going to suffer a little bit, is that there's a cheaper, better option now, and that's large language models. So this begs the question, how do you avoid getting killed by these innovations like this? What would a company like Tailwind need to do? And here's my read, having been in commercial open source for 11 years now. You need to move up the value chain. There's two different distinct markets you sell to when you're doing developer tooling. The first is selling directly to developers. And this is selling things like books, selling maybe things like software subscriptions for tools like Cursor or JetBrains Writer or whatever. Or you also can be in the business of selling things like individual components for not just necessarily CSS, but also like desktop applications. And that's all been sort of well-established businesses for a long time. It's not just Tailwind who's in the component business. The problem I think you're going to run into, if you take a look at my framework here, is that look at this in terms of why people are buying. If I'm working on a side project, I've bought Tailwind templates before, actually. Or maybe it was a Bootstrap template. I don't remember anymore. I think it was actually a Bootstrap template that I bought. Why did I buy that several years ago? I wanted to build a nice internal dashboard, and I am so primitive when it comes to doing UI development. And plus, this is just like a behind the firewall application that I have no intention of selling. I just want to go ahead and get something that I like looking at in order to run my business every day. I was totally willing to go ahead and shell out, I think it was, I don't know, $100, maybe $50 to go ahead and buy that. No problem. And that's because this was about me trying to get a result immediately. That's why I buy as an individual user. And if I'm an individual Cursor user or a Claude Code user using this for my own personal use, meaning I'm not part of a big enterprise organization or whatever, this is just me, solo coder, doing my own thing, cost is a really big factor. And AI wins both in terms of dollar cost, at least for right now. There's a very good chance that changes in the future, just like how the price of Uber rides shot up once they had kind of established a market for that. But the gist of this is that I get very low dollar cost to basically get results, and I don't have to wait very long to get them. And that is an extremely attractive proposition for me if I'm not trying to build something for the sake of learning how it works. If I'm trying to solve a business problem and just move on, I don't really care. I just want to get something that lights up and beeps, and then I want to move on and get about the rest of my business. So I've been using Claude Code super heavily for writing like internal tools here at Petabridge. I don't care if they're absolute junk internally. None of them are doing anything customer facing. None of them are doing anything that's essentially going to require me to care that much about preserving data over a long period of time. It's all about basically automating things I have to do manually today. And in that context, you're going to have a really tough time if your business model before large language models was trying to solve those same tools in methods that are both more dollar expensive or more time expensive. So another business model that might get really impacted by this is education as a business. One of the things we sell as part of our support plans is training. The only people who can attend, in fact, let me open this up. The only people who can attend our online academic trainings here, and I'll include a link to this, are typically people who have support plans. Sometimes we'll let people in who are thinking about buying one, as long as they say they're going to. But generally speaking, this is like a big value add as part of our support plans. And we get people who sign up for these all the time because the real benefit behind this is live instruction. People will ask questions about, how do I solve XYZ for my business with Akka.net? And that's something that's easier to get kind of a good strategic answer from me than it is from a large language model. Education as a business, if I was selling written courses or videos, that might be a tougher sell. One of the things that is absolutely true about large language models is they have commodified expertise via the vast amount of information incorporated into their training data sets. So expertise is really what you're selling when you're trying to educate developers. That has been commodified pretty heavily. Now, I don't think that business model is going away. Video is still a very popular format, hence why we're all here. But then on top of that, I think generally speaking, a lot of people who are wise and want to basically have some longevity in the software development space recognize that large language models are probably not going to replace the entire activity of software development. It's more like a higher level abstraction, kind of like how a managed language is on top of C++, and how C++ is a higher level abstraction on top of assembly, and you get it. The other thing is that if your business model is all around trying to reduce the learning curve and using that as a moat, this is what Tailwind does, that's going to get completely just blown out by large language models offering users a much lower path of least resistance. So this brings me to the next point here is, okay, If these business models are basically threatened, these include plugins, themes, skins, basically selling courses and tutorials, that type of thing. What is left as a viable business model? Well, here's what I mean by moving up the value chain. B2B open source models, I think, will be totally unimpacted by artificial intelligence. If anything, they'll actually grow as a result of it. And this is why. What are you ultimately selling when you sell a support plan for Akka.net? If you might ask me. Well, sure, you get access to our training. That's useful. You get the ability for me and my team to answer questions in sort of a time-bounded fashion, depending upon which tier of our support subscription you buy. But the real thing that we're selling is our accountability and our availability. When something breaks at 2 a.m. in production, you don't want a LLM hallucinating solutions. I literally had a customer hit me up at 10 p.m. on a Friday, and we worked till 1:30 in the morning last week trying to solve a production issue. And that is very valuable for them. And the reason being is that this doesn't happen very often, but when it does, you want someone who's contractually obligated, who's familiar with how this technology works, to be able to help you start figuring out where to look. And bear in mind, these are complex business applications. These aren't indie hacker side projects. These are manufacturing systems or power grid management systems or trade order capture systems. These are all super valuable, $100 million to multi-billion dollar applications. They are going to be willing to pay for support subscriptions to have the vendors who build the components that software is built on top of to step in and help when they're needed. So selling a support plan is much more like selling an insurance policy than it is selling your expertise. That's why I don't think this business model is going to go out of style. That accountability, that throat to choke model still needs to be there. The other area that I think is going to do really well is still infrastructure and managed services. This is things like telemetry products or selling hosted services. So a company like Pulumi, for instance, which is open source, and you have the ability to self-host your own sort of Pulumi state management system. Dude, you'd be crazy to do that. It's much better paying Pulumi $600 a year or whatever it costs to use their hosted service for that, because I don't have to basically screw around with trying to figure out how to configure, manage, backup, and sync everything. That's all just amortized into the cost of what I pay Pulumi every year. And so this sort of managed service business is never going to go out of style. Even large language models ultimately don't want to have a large total cost of ownership. You could, in theory, get them to stand up all this infrastructure for you, but you're still ultimately responsible for that. What big organizations like is for someone else to be responsible so they can turn around and beat you with a bat in the event that something goes wrong. And this is what vendors like Petabridge, Vercel, and hundreds of other companies that basically have a strong open source tie-in are happily and readily available to supply to big enterprises. Now, the other thing I can point out here a little bit is that complex technologies like Akka.net or N-Service Bus, this is not like a CSS framework. We explained in the previous video, we talked about the concept of blast radius. Well, dude, if you're running a large trade order capture system for a big, let's say foreign currency trading operation that a bank's using, you're not going to want to go ahead and say, you know what, we don't need to hire the people who built our fix system to go and diagnose it. No, we can go ahead and have Claude analyze why our trades aren't being posted to the exchange. And your CTO or CIO will look at you like you are insane if you suggest something like that. The reason being is that saving let's say it costs $10,000 for a support subscription like that. A company like that basically has a system that critical, that system being down for even just a couple of hours, the company's going to lose way more than $10,000. So the asymmetry of what the vendor's asking for versus the value that the customer is getting are incredibly large. That's why looking at this saying, oh, well, we could save $10,000 by not paying Petabridge to support Akka.net seems like a decision that indie hackers would make because they basically they have nothing to lose if their system goes down. It's not something that your big giant banking, insurance, transportation, energy, or healthcare companies are going to reason about. That's not how they operate at all. Their risk profile is completely different. The basic gist of this here is that when it comes to open source business models, you're going to potentially need to pivot if your business model is all built around alleviating friction to adopting your technology. That is not going to be a sustainable strategy long-term. LLMs are going to get better and better at commodifying that, and that problem will get a lot worse before it gets better. And one of the other things I should mention is that another reality you should probably accept is that the biggest consumers of your documentation tutorials probably going to be large language models. It's going to be more valuable as a training set resource than it will be a thing that humans read. That is probably where the puck is going over the next 10 years, and that sucks. That disappoints me from a sort of artistry and craftsmanship standpoint, but we have to adapt to reality if we want to survive as business owners. This is what that's going to look like long term. Another thing I pointed out here that I thought was somewhat ironic. So I've written a whole bunch of posts about things like relicensing open source projects, because that's happened quite a bit in the .NET ecosystem. Ironically enough, large language models recommending well-established libraries that are heavily incorporated into the training data sets might benefit projects that are relicensed quite heavily. The reason being is like I use, for instance, Fluent Assertions. I use them quite a bit before they're relicensed. Claude continuously recommends installing it into new applications because that's a abundant pattern that shows up everywhere in their .NET training data set, even though it's all commercially licensed now. And I have to constantly pull it back out or downgrade it to an older version, largely because, honestly, I don't think the new versions are worth the value. It's an assertions library. I could go and just go back to not using it anytime I want. So the basic gist of this is that I think that your business model probably needs to pivot if it's all built around reducing friction currently. So what Tailwind could become? What would be my approach if I were Tailwind? Well, what Tailwind has that's super invaluable is they have impeccable taste when it comes to doing CSS. They are, I think, probably the world leaders in this right now. They have a massive adoption footprint. And then on top of that, they have a ton of people who would love to see them succeed. They had a giant outpouring of support after Adam's post went viral this week, and I think that's great for them. But they could go ahead and parlay that into a whole bunch of tools that get them better aligned with this sort of AI universe. Probably the best example of this would be for them to start selling AI-powered design tools. Vercel has this V0 tool for being able to generate UI components on the fly. Tailwind could probably do something even better than that. They could probably also do things that are much more, let's say, support contract oriented around doing custom design. There's a number of different ideas here that would allow them to kind of move further up the value chain. Whether they want to do these or not really comes down to philosophy, and also they know a lot more about their potential markets than I do. So this could all seem like nonsense to them. Take it or leave it. This is just kind of my perspective on it. But the basic gist of this is I don't think AI is going to kill open source. I don't think it's going to kill open source businesses either. I think it is going to definitely drive some changes, particularly around documentation, tutorials, learning curves, and other resources that are designed to help reduce adoption friction. That whole relationship between the project and how people learn how to use it is transforming a lot already. And there's going to need to be a lot more work done to make that even easier in the future. And I think business models that relied on kind of like turning some of that friction into money, I think those models are in big trouble and they need to pivot to something else. Moving up the value chain towards B2B and enterprise, I think is a good way to go. It's certainly not the only way to go, but if I wanted to look at something that was sticky, I would do that. I do have to mention, though, out of our own experience here at Petabridge, there are definitely some new problems that get introduced when you move up the value chain a little bit, which is namely that selling to businesses takes a very long time and a lot of patience and a lot more paperwork than it does just setting up a buy now button on your website. So that might be a bit of a culture shock for people who've been able to sell directly to individuals before. So anyway, that's it for this video. If you have any thoughts or comments on the state of open source and how it's going to get impacted by AI, please leave them below. Otherwise, I'll catch you next time. Thank you very much.
Well, that'll do it for this video. If you found this video useful, please don't forget to check the description to find links to other resources we may have included. So blog posts, GitHub code samples, other videos, so on. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. We'll catch you next time. Thank you very much.